Live from Vienna, Austria, it's theCUBE, covering .next Europe 2016. Brought to you by Nutanix. Here's your host, Stu Miniman.
Welcome back to theCUBE, the worldwide leader in enterprise technology coverage. Happy to welcome back to the program a multi-time guest, the CEO of Nutanix, Dheeraj Pandey. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
And thank you for bringing us to Vienna here. Over 1,300 people here, obviously from a lot of different countries, general excitement in the air. Tell us where your mind's at.
Well, I mean, we've always been a global company. For the last couple of years, we've had about 35% of our business come from outside the US. So bringing the event to Europe was actually a big deal for us, and we said, let's just go and be a company that's global, but acting locally as well. So I'm just exhilarated and just to see the response and the love that customers actually have, and hopefully the hope that prospects have for this company.
Okay, can you speak a little bit to kind of both your company and how you partner? How do you reach that global audience, and especially in Europe?
So we have employees in 40 countries, but we ship to 90 countries already. And a lot of that is happening because of the channel and the distribution strategy that we actually have. Obviously, the OEMs are doing some of this as well, so Dell is doing it, Lenovo is doing it, and our reseller partners do it as well. So I think a combination of distribution through OEMs and distribution and reseller relationships with the VARs is helping us a lot.
All right, so you talked about in the keynote this morning, the IPO went, there's a lot of changes, everybody's watching, all the pieces, happening with Nutanix, and when I talked to Sunil this morning, it was kind of, wrapping up phase one, or, so still plenty of work to do in phase one, obviously, with hyperconverged, but going to phase two. I spoke with you a few weeks back talking about kind of the post-IPO, but just kind of the state of the company, maturation of the company, what's your take on where we are and where we're going?
Well, the next 6 to 8 quarters, it's heads down, execution, both on R&D side as well as sales and marketing side. In some level, obviously the public market investor is going to expect a lot from us in the next 2 years. And we also have to basically establish our identity, because obviously when you do this kind of an operating system work, it's very hard to put you in a category. Are you a compute company, a storage company, a hypervisor company, or are you getting networking? What does that mean? So in that sense, we have a lot of hard work ahead in terms of defining our overall category. And hyperconverged to me is basically a very inane word. I mean, it means nothing really. I mean, to say that we can go and solve real problems for people, do it faster, quicker than anybody else, and reduce the OpEx is probably where the real delight lies. So, looking at, and we've co-designed this Wall Street Journal ad with the rest of the team. And there's obviously VMware, there's Amazon, where do we fit in? And it's a pretty wide gap that we need to go and define.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've talked about it a few times, but the first time we interviewed you, I think it was over 4 years ago now, it was talked about, the computer science issue of our day is talking about distributed architectures. And that's not a converged or even hyper-converged issue. It's a much bigger, it's a software problem. And that's at the core, the core of your engineering team, the core of your background. And so, are you just a software company at the end of the day, or what is Nutanix when it's fully grown up?
I think you rightly mentioned the distributed systems part of it. Because many of these hyper-converged solutions, they're using mostly VMware and then replacing a bit of it and adding their own little color to it. And then we are saying we need to redefine the control plane and redefine the data plane, redefine the abstractions of drag and drop from one stack to another. So there's a lot of work that's going on which uses commodity servers and distributed computing methodologies to go and build these solutions actually on top. I mean, today as you saw from the keynote, looks like it's echoing a little bit, from the keynote, that customers are actually looking for solutions that actually work at scale. And working at scale would require you to really go and use the power of multiple machines and still be able to deliver the facade of a single system. So at the core, this company is really a software company, but we're also very mindful of how not to throw software over the wall. Because that's what a lot of software companies do. They try to optimize for the Wall Street model, as opposed to optimizing for the customer model, where Wall Street model will actually take care of itself.
Yeah, so it sounds more like the discussions I have when I talk to the hyperscale companies. It's the Googles and Amazons of the world. That's the mindset that they have, as opposed to, I'm an infrastructure guy by background, but that's kind of the traditional enterprise and hardware-centric view of things.
Yeah, you're always trying to classify a company as a software company or a hardware company or an appliance company
Services,
or some other company.
Yeah.
But what does Main Street want? Not what Wall Street wants, but what Main Street wants is abstract it out, make it invisible, make it simple, and it doesn't matter how. Because we don't ask this question to a cloud company, like, hey, are you a hardware company or software company? It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we are delivering solutions that make our customers' lives easier.
Yeah. So the IPO, the timing of that was something you needed to sort out. We're in uncertain times in global economic markets. How does that impact how you run the company and how the company moves forward?
Well, so definitely a few things have happened in the last 2-3 years, and not just in the US, but with Brexit, a pretty close Austrian elections, and what probably we'll see with local elections in Germany and other such places. People are questioning, okay, we talked about globalization, and it actually has an impact on flow of people and trade and goods and all this stuff across the world. But what about me? What about my job and my standard of living and things like that? So it definitely brings to focus that localization of globalization. And we say this all the time. It's also a cliched thing to say that you think global but act local. And a little bit of that is showing up in terms of the rebellion from people saying this globalization thing is not localized and it's not empathetic to who I am and what my job is and so on. So you'll see countries actually hunker down a little bit, in trying to say, look, we overdid globalization. We need to start thinking about our own people as well. And just like, it happened with farming, like a lot of people are saying farmers market and local produce and things like that. Some of that will happen with consumer goods and even technology to a certain extent. And the idea of cloud computing will also get a nuance in this because there are 150 countries, and I talked about this in my presentation as well, that at the end of the day, if it's like power, if it's like water, if it's like gas, if it's utility, you just can't have only 100 data centers or 200 data centers around the world. You need to have thousands and tens of thousands of data centers around the world because the SLAs are actually quite complex. There's not just 5 nines availability, it's security, compliance, data safe harbor, on and on and on. So this idea of seeding the cloud at a smaller local level, to me, actually becomes even more relevant in this new world. And it transcends beyond the US elections. It's just across the board. I think people don't realize that there is a very complex pulse of computing, notwithstanding all this stuff about who owns the data, who owns the rights to the information and the application and things like that. Just makes up for the case of how cloud companies will have to miniaturize their operating system. Like Azure is talking about an appliance. There's rumors of Amazon talking about an appliance and so on. So everybody will have to coexist in an appliance world and in 2 racks as well as in 2,000 racks. So have you built an operating system that also works in 2 racks versus just 20,000 racks itself?
We talked a little bit this morning with Sunil about in 2017, Microsoft's expected to ship, Azure Stack, and we will see the VMware on Amazon solution, and I'll be at Amazon reInvent later this month. We'll see, how many straws does Amazon stick in the data centers, and are there some appliances that end up getting there to being there? Different set of competitors than the traditional, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, IBM, Oracle, who you partner with, but there.
Look, today the hyper-converged vendors, they say that they compete with Nutanix, but they all need the entire stack. Cisco and HP and a lot of these companies, at the end of the day, are hardware companies, and they go and take an entire VMware stack and then replace a bit of the storage component and put their own little thing. But they still need the hypervisor, the container stack, the operations management stack, the systems management, and all that stuff around it. Software-defined networking, security, things like that. I mean, at some level, we're building an operating system, and if anything, we are a little bit of a lesser operating system because we think that we have to also make it a little non-nerdy, non-geeky. Thinking about credit cards and subscription and spot pricing and app store, those metaphors of e-commerce have to meld into the operating system definition itself so that it's not just about compute and storage and virtualization. We have a very bottom-up view of technology as opposed to thinking top-down about the end user, the developer, the app administrator, folks who actually don't care what a hypervisor is and what fiber channel is and what iSCSI is and what NFS and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting. The question I was thinking of is, if you ask customers, the old maxim, if Henry Ford said, if we had asked our customers what they wanted, better buggy whips and faster horses and the like. If I go to an enterprise IT, yes, they want simpler environments. Obviously, that's pretty easy, but a micro-segmentation on the security and the networking. I mean, I look at the areas that you guys are adding to. What is the driver? What's kind of the true north of the company to kind of set as to where your direction is versus, how much are you getting the feedback from the customers? I think as Rajiv said, when the customers ask for it, it should be there, not, the even 6, 12, or 18 months, delivery cycle once they ask for something.
Well, one thing is that we have to think about the end user. The consumer of infrastructure is not the infrastructure admin. The consumer is a developer. The consumer is an app administrator. And they're thinking about apps. They're not thinking about VLANs and load balancer rules and firewall rules or a VM or a container. They're thinking about the whole thing. And that's the blueprint. They want to clone and provision and migrate and backup and do all sorts of verbs on this one noun. And the noun is not these disparate components of a fiber channel zone and a VLAN and a load balancing switch or a rule and so on and so forth. So when you bring it all together into an application specification, now it becomes really interesting because now when you provision an app, the firewall should get pre-programmed automatically, the load balancer should be pre-programmed, the network should get programmed. So there's the real true north for Nutanix is what would an app need and how would the app user think about using these different elements, which is networking or security and storage and compute and things like that. And in that sense, all we're trying to do is to make infrastructure more consumable, not by folks who are specialists in their own little area, who get a ticket and they actually go and work on the ticket and takes weeks of round trip to get the ticket resolved for the entire app to be provisioned. But instead, how do you automate the heck out of it such that you don't even need to file a ticket because the developer can consume these things unbeknownst to what these things really do and how do they get implemented.
How much does your team need to get into the weeds of the application? I heard announcements about SAP and Oracle, Citrix up on stage, or how much of it is the kind of puppet chef, those kind of things where I can identify a workload and then just use you as a platform?
Well, so the automation APIs definitely belong to us because we actually talk about what are the things we want to actually make configurable and programmable, which is what the APIs do. And then on top of the APIs, you definitely can use any kind of plugin framework, Python binding, Ruby binding, and use your favorite configuration management system. It could be a Puppet, for example, and maybe that CMDB belongs in ServiceNow, or maybe it belongs in Puppet, or what have you. And they can be the Uber orchestrators and the Uber configuration managers. But then we want to at least do a good job of not being a heterogeneous orchestrator, a heterogeneous configuration database, but just for our own little ecosystem, can we manage the best configuration, and can we be the best orchestrator actually? So that then the Uber orchestrators can work on top of us and automate Nutanix and something else along with it. Maybe there's Nutanix AHV and VMware, maybe it's some Cisco Blades and Nutanix together, because eventually people are looking at something that's Uber, orchestrator as opposed to just a Nutanix specific domain itself.
At the Vegas show, it talked about the Newton Nation. As you're now a public company, we were talking off camera a little bit about companies that need to be careful about going from the insurgent to the incumbent. Does how you hire, how you train your people as you grow, does that change? It's got to be tough to still get, as we said, getting that first 100 people in the valley, is easy. Getting your next 1,000, and keeping that high quality is really tough. How's the culture change as you get larger?
Well, we have to keep evolving with scale because obviously the intent is the same. The intent is to be a politics-free, insurgent mentality company that has owners as opposed to employees work for and then finally the obsession for the end customer, the front line is equally important. So that is the intent, whether with 100 people or 500 people or 1,000 people. How you get to that intent is what changes, because at scale, you need to go and really make the grassroots fabric become kind of shock-proof and scale-proof and stuff like that. So that problem definitely is becoming harder in that sense. And as you said, there's this paradox of growth where growth creates complexity and complexity kills growth. And I think one of the challenges that the company faces is how do you buck the trend of being yet another company that probably reached its whatever $1 billion revenue and then it completely petered away. What are the ways in which you can continue to grow the serviceable TAM? What are the ways in which you can keep the same net promoter score? Because customer support and customer satisfaction at scale is a very hard problem, very difficult problem actually. So having that culture, that mentality of end customers matter, employee-manager relationships matter, and eventually everybody is a customer. We say this all the time. I say this, that HR's customers are every employee in the company. So if you have a net promoter score mentality, whether it's internal employees or external customers or partners, I think good things can happen.
Speaking of the maturity of the company, another thing you talked about in the keynote was the Nutanix Nutanix Heart initiative that you have. Maybe explain a little bit about that, and what are the causes that get you excited personally?
Well, I think as a company matures and as we have a little bit more self-actualizing oxygen, we need to think about not just the business and the gross margin and the strength of the P&L and the balance sheet and things like that. It's like, what is really good business? And I think really good business is if you also get connected to the society, the community at large. And .Heart actually makes us a more robust company because...
Could you just explain what the program is?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's basically a true north for the company to say, look, we try to have a culture of humility and hunger and honesty, but how about giving as well? What does giving mean to us? What does giving mean for individual employees? What does volunteer time off look like so that employees can really go and do things on their own? What does it mean for the company to contribute to causes? Not the least of which is its own gene pool. For example, how do you think of diversity? How do you think of women in tech? How do you think of women in our own company? And we probably haven't done the best of jobs to actually hire women at scale, or even have leaders. I mean, like for example, my reports, none of them are women, so I have to do a better job of that. We have to do a better job of the company where women can look up to leaders in the company and say, I want to be that actually. So in that sense, we are still very vulnerable and we have to get better at those things. And a program like this also reminds us to say, before we go and try to do this thing better for the society and the local schools and things like that, can we do better for ourselves as well? And that overall creates a very robust, a very diverse gene pool that the company can withstand shocks and have employees who are not just loyal but willing to question and basically go back to this bucking the trend of complexity and the growth the complexity that comes with growth itself.
And part of that, my understanding, is you're reaching out to local communities to get things that are involved. Silicon Valley, is always a discussion. Anything back home that you're making sure that the team focuses on when it comes to the community involvement?
One of the things that we observe is why aren't there enough women in tech? And people always point back to schools and colleges saying, there are not enough women and girls graduating. So we are focusing on what does it mean to hire more women from universities, and how do you go back to local schools and see if you can actually go and teach people, and not just people, but girls in particular. We are trying to associate ourselves with girls who code. And so programs like that which go and try to fix the problem upstream as opposed to question why the problem exists downstream itself.
All right, I remember back, gosh, I'm trying to think, it was Miami at the first .next conference. You talked about your various constituents and hinted that you'd have the new one, the financial services. So as final note, could you just walk through kind of your employees, your customers, your partners, and the financial? What do you want them taking away from this event that you've had, where Nutanix is and where they're going?
Well, for the employees, customers, and partners, it is the fact that we are trying to get more empathy for them. That's why localization matters, that's why coming here matters, that's why talking to, because EMEA is a large world in itself. Europe by itself is not homogeneous, it's like, tens of countries. There's Middle East, there's Africa, which is another continent by itself, there's Russia, which looks like a continent by itself, a world by itself. So to understand each of these countries and constituencies, it requires a lot of doing events like these actually. So that's what this idea of let's get empathy for Germany and France and Portugal and Spain and every little country that we can think of is very important for us. And I think for Wall Street, I think it's going to take care of itself. I really believe that if we did right by our employees, if we did it right by our customers and partners, then in the long run, I've said this before, stock market is extremely fair. Extremely fair. In the short run, nobody controls because the mob controls. But in the long run, a lot of goodness emerges. If you as a company have the right hygiene, have the right guardrails, avoid waste. A lot of stuff is about wastage. When you grow big, you try to do too many things. You don't fail fast enough. You don't cut things fast enough. You're not making tougher decisions because you end up becoming a soft company. I talk about soft. The word soft is equally important to us now at scale because you have soft products that don't sell. That's waste. You have soft talent that you're not trying to manage out. You're making softer decisions in the interview process because you're trying to be a nice company. I think you just have a soft culture where you're not willing to stand up to the inequities and the inefficiencies that actually come to exist. So in all little ways, I think what Wall Street helps you do is become and continue to stay a tough company where you can continue to make tough decisions. And if you keep doing those things in a hygienic way, then the share price takes care of itself, actually.
Well, Dheeraj, it's always a pleasure to be able to talk with you. Really appreciate you having theCUBE be able to be here at the inaugural event. And I agree, the world could definitely use some more empathy as we go forward. So thank you much for joining us. We'll be back with lots more coverage here from the Nutanix first .next in Europe. You're watching theCUBE.